Hello, Sally.
Hi, Sally.
Well, this month we're going to talk to you about the charts of two ladies who spoke truth to power in their time and paid the price. And so, Sally, who's the first lady that we are looking at?
So we are looking at or starting with Martha Mitchell. And for those people that may not be familiar with her, there have been two programs recently on television that featured stories about her, but she was a political, mainly a political spouse of Attorney General John Mitchell, and he was involved in the President Nixon administration between 1968 and 1974. He was actually the campaign manager also for Richard Nixon's original election campaign in 68, and then his re-election campaign in 1972.
Yeah, that committee to re-elect the president with that acronym.
What was it? CREEP? CREEP. And we were talking earlier, right, about how we sort of lived vicariously through, or were aware of Martha Mitchell in the late 60s, early 70s, because we lived through that time of Watergate. And that was a break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters in Washington, D.C., that was tied to actually that CREEP organization, the Republican Re-elect the President Committee. So, I mean, and Sally, I remember her, this blonde woman,
huge bouffant
hair
from the 60s and 70s. Yeah,
very outspoken. I remember her. I remember reading about her calling reporters, and she was really flamboyant, right? And her colorful outfits. And just recently watching these two television programs. One was a documentary called The Martha Mitchell Effect, and you can explain that to us. And then another television series called Gaslight with Julia Roberts in playing Martha Mitchell, and then Sean Penn playing her husband John.
Yeah, and you can see what an important figure she's considered in history when you think Julia Roberts, one of the highest paid actresses in the world, chose to play this role.
And I think we've come, we're going to be comparing another political person too during our session today, but I think we weren't really prepared for the similarities. There's some similarities between Martha and this other person that we'll get to in a minute. But
yeah, who seem would be apparently two very different people, but yet there were similarities.
So I don't know if there's anything you want to say more about her general personality or your memories of Martha Mitchell in the news at all, Sally.
Well, the one thing in the documentary that just stunned me was Richard Nixon was interviewed after he'd resigned from office, in disgrace, and he was interviewed a few years later. And he said, without Martha Mitchell, there would have been no Watergate. And I thought, wow. It was because she was kind of calling out the Nixon administration that, the attention came to this case. And so it's kind of interesting to think that we would have kept a corrupt president in power for 3 more years without Martha Mitchell being the one who was there calling him out. So I think when we look at her chart, we'll have to see what it is about her that is just gives her that courage really to speak out.
And it is significant because she was a loyal Republican. And was involved in that re-election committee, according to the documentary. And so it took some courage for her to, I think she was the first person to attribute the break-in to the Nixon administration and the president himself. I think she was the first person.
And she was not believed. And so everything she was saying that the Nixon administration was involved in the break-in, they were involved in the cover-up, they were in it up to their necks. Everything she was saying was discounted because people said, oh, she's just a hysterical woman. And she tipples a bit at night before she calls reporters. And so we didn't believe her. And then, of course, once the tapes came out from the Oval Office and conversations were made public, what did we realize?
She was telling the truth. Mm-hmm.
And so that's what psychiatrists consider to be the Martha Mitchell effect, that someone might be saying something which we discount because they seem unstable, and that thing later turns out to be true. So it's kind of interesting that that's part of her legacy today. So anyway, now that we've kind of gotten everyone excited about Martha Mitchell, let's look at her chart and see how this is going to play out. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes.
All right. And so, you know, when you think of somebody who's flamboyant and likes to be in the spotlight, what about her chart just jumps out at us?
Well, that stellium in Leo, and obviously we don't have a birth time for her, so this isn't accurate in terms of the houses, but she's got so many planets there, Saturn, Venus, the moon, and Neptune in Leo.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a flamboyant, wanting attention. So we know from that, or we can assume from that, you know, she did want that attention, and she did enjoy it.
Yeah, and if you look at news footage of her, you know, surrounded by reporters, you can just see she's having the time of her life. And then also we talked about that huge mane of hair that she always had.
Yeah, big blonde hair. And do you remember seeing her in pictures with those sunglasses that she had? That was featured in the TV series quite a bit.
Oh, okay.
She had like these distinctive, you know, white frame, and they were kind of like almost those cat eye sunglasses.
Oh.
I thought those were really striking and
sort of leonine again.
Right. And colorful outfits, I believe that, you know, she often wore.
Yeah, she kind of took the bad fashion of the 70s to a whole new level, I think.
Yeah,
but
that's a good point. We lived through that too. And we probably wore a lot of that.
With Saturn and Leo there, though, Saturn's in detriment in Leo. So it says that, I don't know, you think it kind of limits her a bit to when she does seek power, she can maybe hit some pushback or attention, she gets some pushback.
Well, Saturn and Leo the Saturn would offer some kind of challenge, right? It would, there would be some kind of difficulty there with Saturn.
And then she was born at that Saturn-Uranus opposition. And so this kind of starts us off on the path of speaking truth to power. When you think, I don't know what happens when Saturn butts up against Uranus.
Well, I was just looking, you know, it's Uranus and Aquarius, so that would be pretty rebellious, but with a humanitarian aspect about it too. And so to me, Uranus is about breaking up things, and Saturn is more tradition and the status quo or the establishment. So it seems like her sole intention, using that energy, is to kind of maybe break up the tradition or conservatism in a way, and certainly she did that with the Watergate affair.
And it was kind of interesting, like you said, she was very supportive of the president and supported his reelection until she heard about Watergate, and then the whole story changed for her.
And initially, I think, you know, she had this intuitive sense as well. And again, I think the Uranus and Uranus can be kind of intuitive. I've heard it described as the higher octave of Mercury.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So she had some intuition, and then I think later it became clearer that she wanted to protect her husband, that she was worried that he was going to be the fall guy.
Mm.
And as it turned out, he was one of the fall guys, but he was, responsible as well.
Yeah, and we see, like you pointed out, her high intelligence. She's got Mercury, which is in its own sign and exaltation in Virgo. So she was very shrewd and almost, though, intuitive rather than analytical, which Virgo would suggest. But I don't know, do you think that retrograde Mercury under the beams might suggest more of an intuition, that she just sort of sensed that something was wrong?
I think that makes sense. Definitely. I'm with the retrograde. I was going to say also that, well, we can get to this. It kind of connects to her Pluto.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of the next thing to look at here, because it is working well, even though Mercury's under the beams and retrograde, it is working well with this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the sign of Cancer. So that Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, intensified with Jupiter. So it seems like her intuition had some very real foundation to it when you look at the sextile to Jupiter.
And yeah, Pluto is part of that intuitive, powerful, insightful nature. And you're right, it's working really well together. And you mentioned a quote earlier, and I remember another one, that when she was interviewed by Barbara Walters, what did she want to be remembered most by? And she said something to the effect of, I wanted to be remembered for serving my country. And I think that also brings in the Sun Mercury in Virgo.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of about service too. And then the Cancerian energy is certainly about protection and patriotism.
Yeah, that she really believed in the United States, believed in the integrity of our government and the people running it. And so when she saw that that wasn't the case, it just violated those sort of core beliefs she had, that trust she had. And then kind of setting off, what really tells us speaking truth to power, that would definitely be Mercury going to Pluto. But also, if we look at what's happening here, Mercury and the Sun are in sextile to that Mars, which is in trine to that Jupiter-Pluto. So that's really a powerful configuration. What would you say about that Mars in Scorpio?
Yes, so that Mars in Scorpio would be like, kind of that surgical tool, or the knife, going very deep. Mars in Scorpio, I would think, is very, very determined to look below the surface, and courageous.
Yeah, because Mars is in its own sign of Scorpio. And it would just have a deep core of courage that would take on the battle no matter what the consequences, if you believed you were right. So, but we know from the story of the rest of her life that it did not end so well for her on a personal level. After Nixon resigned, I think, did she and John Mitchell separate at that point?
Yes, I think, well, there was the story too where at the time of the break-in, there was an immediate arrest and there was an immediate connection with the Republican committee, at least, that they were responsible for this break-in. So Martha was sent to California, and she basically was trapped because they didn't want her talking to reporters or reading the news. And later on, it was found out, she was kind of a prisoner. So, and then I believe finally, when the tapes came out that you mentioned, these were, tapes that President Nixon had authorized. So I think he was going to want to write a memoir at the end of his second term eventually. And so unfortunately for him, he did these tapes because they were discovered later. And I think at that time, then she understood that her husband knew about, the entrapment of her. But before, I think she was kind of worried about, protecting him. And then they did separate later. Initially, I think John Mitchell resigned, but it was spread by the White House that it was to protect, help Martha because she's mentally unstable. And, he was going to help his wife when really that wasn't the exact, reality. But they did separate. And as you mentioned, I mean, they never officially got divorced, became divorced apparently. But he also got custody of their daughter. And then she became ill and died only about, I think, 18 months after Nixon resigned.
Right, she was what, 57 years old?
Yeah, 57, not very old. So that's the tragic part too, that she did do a service for the country, and she felt she did, but she paid a price with her marriage, and that probably added to her stress a lot. She was worried about getting in trouble and maybe maybe in fear for her life after that kidnapping situation.
Yeah. So you see that Mars square Neptune, then a lot of disinformation was spread about her. And then the moon, because this is not a time chart, the moon could be anywhere from 2 degrees Leo to 14 degrees Leo. So in any case, the moon would also be in that square from Mars. So you see Mars, a malefic planet, because she spoke truth to power, she paid for it with her own security. Really lost everything by the end of her life. So anyway, this is really a dynamic chart. Even though we don't see the houses and the angles in the chart, you can just see by what the planets are doing that it really captures her flamboyant nature, that drive to always speak the truth, to protect her husband, and to support her country. So amazing chart. So one thing that we thought we would do is take a look at how her chart compares with the US chart, because remember Richard Nixon said if there had been no Martha Mitchell, there would have been no Watergate. And so here is the US Sibley chart on the inside, and then on the outside are Martha's planetary aspects. So can you see that, Sallie?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so what do you see here? How does Martha impact the United States?
Well, I am looking right at that Pluto-Jupiter conjunction right off the bat, right on the US Sun and Jupiter and Venus.
Yeah. So very powerful that Martha, her belief in the country and the integrity of the people who run the country, it's like she's calling out the best. Don't you think, when it hits our Sun, Jupiter, Venus?
And I think along with that, all her Leo stellium is also in the ninth house, and you think of that, and it's on the US North Node. So that's kind of calling out the best too, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I like that.
That higher level destiny of our country. I think there was a real intention, and obviously in the sign of Leo, the leadership that the US can play.
Oh, yeah, I like that. The leadership and the
Yeah.
ninth house, our laws, our values,
Right.
our beliefs.
But I'm glad you said calling, the best, calling out our higher, higher level qualities.
Yeah, on the North Node, because you think America was an idea that was based, it was an ideal for individual liberty. So that's interesting that
We've
we
really
don't feel
been called like an experiment. Democracy has been, it's been kind of a large scale experiment. And how are we doing, at that point in the early 70s? And then again, how are we doing right now?
Yeah, and so interesting too, though, is Uranus is on our US moon.
Yeah, that's really amazing, isn't it?
And the Uranus Saturn opposition. So you think about this moon, a woman, at that time in history was not, women were supposed to be seen and not heard. They're supposed to look, lovely on their politician husband's arm and always never offend anybody. And Martha just violated all of that.
I know, and people are concerned about the numbers of, the male-dominated legislatures and in government and corporations. I mean, in Martha's day, it was all white men, pretty much. All the leaders, and the cabinet wives were supposed to be, supporting their husbands. They were the hostesses. They were not supposed to say anything and anything much, and she bucked that and did want to speak up.
Even before Watergate, she said Richard Nixon never really liked her because she was loud. He did not like women to be loud.
And poor Pat Nixon, she was like the total opposite person, right?
Oh yeah, I can't even picture her ever saying anything.
I don't remember her saying anything.
Yeah.
She was like the dutiful wife, and Martha was like not.
Right, yeah. So this is kind of shows that she had a very dynamic impact on the United States, and definitely goes back to Richard Nixon's observation about her. Okay, but one other thing that we were just thinking about is, why are we talking about Martha Mitchell today?
Sallie, just one thing before we go on to that. I was just noticing. Well, we talked about Mars before in Martha's chart and how it was trining her Pluto, but on the USA chart, look at that.
We can't miss that.
The 12th house, and it's almost like that's kind of the secret house too. And so she was like digging in and exposing some secrets.
Yeah, look at that. Isn't that perfect? That she kind of got, under the bed where all the dust bunnies are and shook them all out. And so yeah, definitely she was kind of working behind the scenes. And to a lot of people, she was kind of the enemy. But in reality, she was really working for the good of the United States and getting corrupt people out of power. So, I'm glad you remembered that.
So anyway, we can move on, but I was just noticing that as you were changing the slides.
Yeah. And we cannot miss her Mars, Jupiter, Pluto trine, because that was really her red badge of courage, I think. Okay, so then just one other question we had is, why are we talking about Martha Mitchell now? Why did, a big network like, I think it was Stars, release a story about, a woman who lived in the 70s and made kind of a big noise then, but hasn't been talked about much since. And so just one thing that's kind of interesting, if we put the time that Gaslit was released, up on the outer wheel of her chart. What do you see being emphasized here?
Well, I see that Saturn on her Uranus again,
Mm-hmm.
and that's opposite the her Saturn as well. So
Yeah.
I think Uranus, kind of speaks to the collective
Mm-hmm.
as well. And so she had kind of an important message. And then obviously we've been having Uranus in Taurus
Mm-hmm.
for the past few years. And as you point out right here, there's a T-square pointing to that Uranus in Taurus. And again, with that, it's pointing, I think, to this collective idea that we better get our situation together or something, or make it more, I mean, not necessarily make it more stable because it's involving Uranus, but we need to kind of maybe upset the status quo, and so we can get a better stability going,
Mm-hmm.
I think. And it's also right there next to that North Node as well, which is kind of interesting too.
Yeah, Uranus has been loud because it's been so close to the North Node this past year. And so, yeah, you think about Martha was born with the Mars Uranus energy in her own chart. And while it's been in our collective these past couple of years, it's kind of like the energy comes along and it picks up the energy of people who came before us who lived with that energy too. That's kind of what Richard Tarnas does in his book when he talks about big aspects and how, like somebody who was born during a certain event, maybe involving slavery, will later become a prominent person in the civil rights movement. And so Martha herself was that person who was kind of speaking to the establishment, saying, you're not doing things right. Things need to change.
And then I think then eventually then it can come around to an higher level stability and change. And we'll see.
Yeah.
We're still working on it.
Yeah, we're works in progress, aren't we? But you can see how her chart was lit up when Gaslit was released, which shows us that the person dies, but the chart does not, which I think is enormously comforting, don't you?
Yeah, that is really interesting to look at that, because that's not something you normally think about. But in this case, it does illustrate that she's coming back into our consciousness.
And the next person we're going to talk about is someone who was born around the same time that Martha Mitchell was coming into her power in Washington. And so why don't you tell us about the next lady we're going to cover who has spoken truth to power and paid the price.
And isn't that so interesting? And you mentioned Richard Tarnas, that's what he talks about in his book, that Liz Cheney, she took the energy of that time and when she was born, and now she's kind of using these energies at this time in her life too. And that was a time of upheaval. And so she was born in 1966.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, as the Vietnam War was heating up, there were a lot of protests. The beginning of protests on campuses, university and college campuses across the US. There was a lot of racial turmoil, lots of things going on. So she was born into that energy.
And notice that Saturn is not that far from opposing Uranus and Pluto in her chart. So a similar energy.
So anyway, back to Liz Cheney. So she has been in our consciousness recently on TV again because of the January 6th hearings, regarding the attack on the Washington Capitol, our capital, nation's capital. And she's been she's been a U.S. representative representing the state of Wyoming. And she's the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney and former Second Lady Lynn Cheney. So, she comes from a political family. And I think you were the one, Sallie, that told me earlier that she's a mother of 5 children.
She is. She is a Wonder Woman.
So there's that Jupiter in Cancer that she
Right.
had, just like Martha.
Right. Yeah.
So lots of Cancerian energy. And I think, she's certainly been doing a thorough job investigating. And of course, her biggest challenge is to hold Donald Trump, the former president, accountable for his involvement with encouraging these, the protests and damage and, resulting deaths and injuries from that incident in early 2021. So I don't know if I'm leaving something out, Sally, if you want to add.
Well, just that she was kind of targeted by Donald Trump to be defeated in the primaries.
And she lost her bid for re-election.
Yeah, because she refused to follow the Republican line of thought that the election was stolen, false thought that the election was stolen, and challenged Donald Trump. She was kind of persona non grata in the Republican Party. Didn't she even at one point lose her position on a committee?
I think that's right. I believe she was originally elected to her legislative position in 2017, but I forget what position she held within the Republican leadership. But I think you're right. She did lose a position, and she was, I believe, one of only 2 Republicans who agreed to be part of this body that's investigating. It was supposed to be, nonpartisan, really, because it speaks to our democracy, and so there were only 2 that stood up, I think, and she was one of them. And I think she's not the chair, but she's the vice chair of that committee.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she just believed that, our democracy is sacred and that any threat to it should be called out and put down. And so Donald Trump and his, millions went to Wyoming and backed her primary challenger. And so she lost her primary election last spring. And so I was not able to run again for her seat. So her political beliefs, her willingness to speak truth to power, cost her career.
And per your point about her, regarding her patriotism, I was just going to note, she definitely has that Cancer stellium there. And I believe she also she's known as a conservative, and many of her policies, she actually went along with supporting Donald Trump in over, 90% or more than 90% of things that he had proposed. She supported all that. So it really is amazing that she's kind of taken this hit too, because she's been a very loyal Republican all the way
kind
along.
Of like Martha Mitchell when you think about it.
Yeah, very similar.
Yeah.
And that protective energy and patriotic energy that you can see with Cancer, because Cancer, I think, can be about protection and nurturing of the homeland. And I believe also that she was very much concerned about protecting the United States from international threats. And I know her father really focused on that too, obviously. with his governmental service. But anyway, I think that's kind of interesting about, it says something interesting about all that Cancer energy in her chart as well
And
as
then
her
what?
mother of 5 kids.
Yeah, and then what rules that Cancer energy?
Yeah, that moon in Sag.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so dramatic because it's in the last degree of Sagittarius.
And that's a critical degree, isn't it? It's that anaretic degree. And so it's almost like, she has a mission, it's like
Yeah,
this
like
is
that.
the final degree where, she has to master that energy. And in Sag, you kind of think of her as having very strong philosophy, philosophies and beliefs. And I think, she does demonstrate that. And then it seems like she has an experience in looking at the big picture as well, or she could have that. It's Sag, do you think?
Yeah, but that she kind of sees not just what's in front of her, but how the future will be impacted. If we make the decisions we make now to enable an election denier, what's that going to mean for our democracy over the next decades? If people lose faith in our vote.
So I think that, I was just going to say, I think that speaks to her willingness to sacrifice, as well as the Saturn over there in Pisces that's squaring the moon. And again, that's in that anaretic degree, that final degree. Only the Saturn obviously is in Pisces.
Yeah,
and
so that's kind of interesting,
that
isn't
sacrifice, that self-sacrifice, her willingness to do that. It's almost like, it looks kind of like destiny there in a way. For her,
it?
at a
Does,
soul
doesn't
level,
it?
you could look at it that way. That she's willing, that she had to kind of stand up and be willing to sort of sacrifice her political, at least her current political positions anyway.
Yeah, because you think about the 11th house being, among other things, what supports our career, the people who support our career. So it would be voters in her case, or it might be other people who support her in the House of Representatives. So kind of her collective, her group, you see that she had to almost choose between her own beliefs and then falling in line, that Saturn in Pisces with the group.
That's a good point. And then with the Chiron there, it's almost like that. The wounding is.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about that do you think it was just very deeply painful for her?
I would think it would be somewhat painful for her, just because she has been tremendously loyal. And as a Leo sun and Mercury, that energy speaks to being someone who values loyalty and is that's important to them. So I'm sure it hurt. And I think in her she gave some kind of concession speech, and I remember seeing something like she was kind of teary-eyed about it. I'm sure she took it personally.
Yeah, to have people vote you out when you've worked so hard and sacrificed so much for them. I had my son and daughter-in-law were going to Wyoming last summer. I said, be sure to stop everyone that you meet in Wyoming and tell them to vote for Liz Cheney.
Well, I think we do appreciate how she has been very diligent about assembling or helping assemble the interviews and the testimony and everything. And it's very methodical, step by step, and that methodical thing kind of reminds me too of her Taurus rising. That she's not going to give up on something. She's going to be very diligent, and maybe step by step, she's not going to rush into things. And at some point she's going to get to the goal. So I think it's been my personal feeling is that it's been very well organized and impressive how she's come across in
Yeah.
the hearings.
And she's got a water trine in her chart, kind of widely, with that Cancer up to Neptune.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so it's a sign-based trine. It's not exactly degree-based, but the energy, I think, is there. And so that kind of tells me that even though she's faced this initial setback, that the tide is kind of carrying her forward, don't you think? That she is with the tide of history.
Oh, that's a good connection, Sally, with the water, the
Mhm.
tide. Yeah.
And the ruler of her chart is this Venus that's down here in Cancer. And notice that her Mars, which is a difficult planet, it's a malefic, is between Venus and Jupiter. So even though she's experienced some setbacks, you think of Mars ruling her 7th house of open enemies. And also her 12th house of hidden enemies. There's kind of a protection built in here with these 3 planets right here at her IC. So I think she's got some sort of inner resources, and that's going to support her and carry her forward. Does that seem a little far-fetched?
I think that totally makes sense what you just said. And I mean, she comes from a bit of a political dynasty. And so I would think that there would automatically be some protection with that. I mean, her father has been involved in government service for, years and years. And, just from a practical standpoint, I would think that, she's not going to be left hanging in the wind. There would be some protection, but that's a good point about the 2 benefics, offering protection near her ICA kind of. I mean, Mars might be right in there, obviously, but with the 2 benefics, I would think that they overpower the Mars.
Yeah, the kind of, even though people are shooting arrows at her, she's got good shields. And I think we probably all expect that she's not going to go away politically, that she'll land on her feet. And even though she's lost her House seat, she'll have other opportunities.
Well, she's still relatively young, and let's see, and she hasn't reached her Saturn.
No, because Saturn's only in Aquarius now. So 23, 24, 25 will be Saturn returning for her. So yeah, she's got plenty of time. So, and then the other thing was this Sun Mercury. Like Martha had that Mercury retrograde and under the beams. So I think that kind of adds to this willingness to speak your truth. Mercury becomes very much kind of drafted by the Sun, kind of brought into its service because it's so close. And retrograde, you tend to speak more from your gut. And so I think she just has that intuitive energy to always speak her truth. And then a strong 3rd house too enables her to get her point across to others. So lots of good things in her chart. But why don't we look to see how Liz Cheney's chart matches with the US chart? Is she going to have some dynamic aspects with the US chart like Martha Mitchell did? So we've got, Liz Cheney is on the outer wheel, and the US Sibley chart's on the inner wheel. So what's the first thing we see here?
Yeah, well, we see again all that Cancerian energy on the US Sun and Jupiter and the stellium there. And then again, we see her Leo energy right on the US North Node again. So similar to Martha. Isn't that amazing?
Isn't that funny? Yeah, bing, bing.
Yeah.
So she's kind of bringing us to our kind of our moral center here. Would you call that North Node in Leo?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of spoke about that earlier, and then jumping to that idea of about, our best selves, or our higher level intention about this experiment with democracy. Like, look at that, her Pluto and Uranus in Virgo. It's interesting because Martha had the Sun and Mercury in Virgo, and then Liz has the Pluto Uranus in Virgo. So I'm looking at Pluto Uranus there as kind of like cleaning things up.
Mm.
I don't know if
Yeah.
that's right. And then look at how it hits the US Neptune, which is sort of a higher ideal. I mean, you can use that energy that way of Neptune. And so it's again sort of taking us to task, or reminding us what our higher self really, what our higher self intention is.
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln famously said, we have to call on the higher angels of our nature. And so definitely it seems like Liz Cheney is doing that for our country.
And then it's opposite the Saturn down there in her 29th degree. So again, that's sort of, calling to task, or wanting more effort there.
Yeah, that Saturn Uranus energy that she was born with is coming right to kind of our higher nature, that Neptune, our ideal.
And making our higher ideal more concrete.
Yeah. And you think about Neptune and Virgo, our country was founded on the belief that our leaders are not our rulers, our leaders are our servants, that they work for us. And, George Washington was very clear that he did not want to be king. He was there to serve. And so, yeah, that's really strong, I think, in the chart, that she's reminding us of that. And that critical eye too, calling out people who are not serving the country.
Yeah, because that Virgo energy, both in both their charts, it does offer a discernment, and they're going to notice when things aren't quite right. And then her Sun and Mercury, it's like shining a light on the North Node.
Yeah, that calling out truth to power again. And nobody thanks you at the time.
Right. Yeah. It took a while, because Martha Mitchell, she's been really ignored, in history, and was still sort of, I mean, people kind of ended up believing her later. But again, like, a lot of women, they've tended to be discounted, and now it's good that she's being somewhat recognized and understood a little bit more. Just television programs. And television is a very powerful tool for the collective, because we're all influenced by, we all kind of, people in the industry certainly influence us, and vice versa. But it is a powerful tool to sort of educate and
that's true,
help understand.
If people learned about Watergate in history class, they might hear about Martha Mitchell as kind of a footnote, but that she was such a key player. And really, even in this day and age, individual courage still counts for a lot. And so for one individual to stand up and call out a whole government, it takes an amazing amount of courage.
And sometimes it's the women that have to do that now lately.
Interesting, isn't it? Yeah, and so if you look at Liz Cheney's, Neptune herself, her ideals, are in trine here. So
And Sally, I think you had mentioned earlier before, when we were talking and about this before, that there's a Grand Cross there. Do you want to mention that isn't there a mutable Grand Cross?
Let's see, with her moon.
I think her Saturn moon square forms a Grand Cross
Mhm.
of the US, Mars, Neptune. I thought that was a
Right,
good
that's
that you
true, but it's almost like how she got in the crosshairs. Because the US has, let's see, maybe I'll undo all the drawings so we can see it clearly. So the US has a Mars Neptune square in their chart natally, and then Liz Cheney has
a moon
a moon
Saturn.
Saturn square, and so they form a Grand Cross.
Because I hadn't noticed that before. And it's interesting to me that, okay, so this is kind of a mutable energy.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at, cardinal, fixed, and mutable is making way for the next cardinal leadership kind of energy to come through. And I don't know, there's just something about that made me think, well, she's sort of setting the stage for a new type of cardinal energy.
Yeah, I like that because
With this tension.
mutable times are the old is not quite over and the new has not yet begun.
Mm-hmm.
You think like a mutable season would be for example, let's see, in September, when it's summer is not quite over, but fall hasn't yet quite begun, that sort of in between time. So I like that
You're not quite sure where, things are going to go yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And also we know that by transit, Neptune is right here. So
there's that uncertainty kind of feeling, but it has to be that way to make way for the new.
Yeah, Neptune is here. In fact, I can draw it in. Let's see. So we've got Neptune by transit here. And then we've got Mars by transit here right now. And so that's kind of right now our Mars-Neptune square is being set off by transiting Neptune-Mars. And so you can see how Liz Cheney's moon Saturn just fits right into that. So she has lost, but has she really lost? And I think that's when we get to prediction time. So we'll look at her chart compared with what's going to be happening in 2028. Because we're kind of thinking that 2024 might be too soon for her. I don't know, do you think so, to kind of rally?
So I think you did a particular, or you're gonna show that chart for the January 26th, 2028. So how did you pick that, Sally?
I was thinking, this is something I heard on the astrology podcast. Chris Brennan talked about when the eclipses fall between people's 10th and 4th houses, or 1st and 7th houses, the angular houses, that tends to indicate that this is a person who's going to succeed in that election. And so I was thinking, when we get to 2028, the eclipses are going to be North Node eclipses are going to be in Liz Cheney's 10th house and 4th house, the South Node 4th house, 10th house, her career. And so this is the day of the eclipse in January, which would be when people are starting their runs for president. And so what do you think is happening in her chart?
So this is a new moon.
An eclipse.
A solar eclipse. And look at, the Pluto right there on her son is
Yeah.
amazing, isn't it? Wow.
Yeah, so this is pretty dynamic, don't you think?
And it's right on the 10th house there.
Yeah, so her own midheaven is 19 Capricorn, which shows, her public role has been to be sort of a moral teacher.
Mm-hmm.
But 10th house would indicate all the things happening in her career at that point. And so I thought this was really interesting that in 2028, we're definitely going to be seeing a new generation rising up. I don't think our baby boom friends will be running for president. Unless they do like a weekend at Bernie's Bill and put sunglasses on dead bodies and
Well, I've heard you say before, it's the Pluto and Leo generation doesn't like to get off the stage.
yeah. Yeah, so the world is just full of old men, who are running things. A few old women. So anyway, so we see that this is a dynamic thing in her 10th house and opposing her son Mercury. And then Saturn, what's that doing in her chart?
So I see the Saturn over there in the 12th, and then you're right, it is trining her moon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Saturn is her career planet. And so having transiting Saturn moving right along, I think is going to help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Saturn, Saturn is ruling both her 9th and 10th.
Mm-hmm.
And the Venus is there on her 11th house. I mean, I think of that as the public too.
Yeah, definitely. That's her audience.
So having that Venus shining there is, I think is significant.
Yeah, and then I like that at this point in time, we're going to have sort of a sweet little aspect. We're going to have Neptune. And what else is it doing?
Oh, right.
This is where people are pointing towards a more progressive era coming.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, and how is this affecting her chart? But,
those are such nice sextiles. Wow.
So she's having a lot of dynamic. This isn't going to say she's going to win the presidency, but I think she has a very good chance of being the candidate, don't you think?
Yeah, or if not, maybe there's going to be some other leadership role. Mm-hmm. And it will be interesting. When would her second Saturn return be, do you think?
Now that would be sooner than that. I think, was that 2026? I can look it up in the ephemeris real quick.
Yeah, that's okay. But I think we were, kind of speculating earlier, would she have some more, growth?
That was something you were thinking about, because we're going to have Saturn and Neptune coming together on her Saturn right here.
I'm glad you can remember all these things, Sallie.
Yeah, so she's going to have right here, Neptune and Saturn are going to be together. And then Saturn itself will be returning there. So that will be, I think, in 2025. So what's that going to mean, do you think, when she's got Saturn returning with Neptune?
Well, again, adding, making your dreams more real, perhaps. But I think it'll be interesting if we remember this. If I remember, at that time, we should put it on our calendars.
I know, just go on our phones and put, is Liz Cheney running for president?
Yeah, or something. Yeah, I don't know, because that'll be in preparation for maybe this 2028. But thanks for sharing that information on the eclipse. Looking at the
I was just thinking the eclipses will be significant then. And maybe as Saturn and Neptune meet on her Saturn, that might be when she garners some support that she needs from followers to win.
Oh, okay, right, in the 11th house.
And then you have thought too possibly about expanding her worldview a bit in Pisces. Maybe some of her policies not quite as conservative.
Inclusive, yeah.
More inclusive.
Yeah. Or I mean, making them more inclusive, because I mean, I think I've heard people comment that they've been very impressed with her demeanor and her preparation and her courage in these hearings, but all her policies have been something that many Democrats would not support, and they like her much better now, but it would still be hard to support some of her very conservative beliefs. And I think we're going to be, as a society, more progressive, whether some people are ready to go there or not. But that seems to be moving forward. And certainly with younger generation, there's kind of an evolutionary aspect to this whole growing and changing. And she has, notably, I remember her younger sister is gay, and Liz Cheney was against gay marriage, I believe, or some policies that would benefit gay people. And she's since come around to saying she felt like she was wrong about that. And certainly having a family member with all that Cancer energy, that helped maybe convince her. I remember, I think we were kind of speculating something happening with her children.
Yeah, I was thinking, who else could help her change her mind to be more forward-looking? Pluto, Uranus here in her 5th house.
And right, exactly, in the 5th house with the children. So
in trine to her midheaven.
Yeah, so you just kind of wonder if somehow, as her children develop and mature further, that maybe they'll be the ones that will help influence her to be a little more simpatico with the younger generation and more progressive ideas.
Kind of moving to where the world's going instead of trying to hold it back to that ideal place where you thought it was, which is sort of kind of that Pluto and Capricorn energy.
So this has turned out to be really interesting with these two women, because I don't think we would have we sort of put them together kind of randomly in a way. I mean, they both, to look at it at the surface, they're both blonde Republican women. They were different generations. We knew that they kind of, spoke up against some pretty high governmental people, the President of the United States. But we didn't really think that there would be these similarities that we've seen today.
I know. And you think if Martha Mitchell had been born in 1966, wouldn't she be leading Liz Cheney's life today? Just that those same qualities of she demanded the best from her government and believed the government capable of its best and would speak up when it wasn't, and pay the price.
Yeah. Anyway, I think this has been very interesting. So thank you, Sallie.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining me and for bringing this to my attention. I feel like my mind has been blown.
Well, I think this is like the collective, and how we I do learn some things from watching television.
Yeah. We aren't just vegging out when we watch TV, right? We're learning. Okay, Sallie. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next month. Bye. Bye, Sallie.
Bye, Sallie.